A couple of weeks ago when we met, we had the first talk about the formation of priests and how this grew out of one of the synods, and in 1992, Pope John Paul II, who just this past Sunday was canonized, he was the one who authored the work entitled, I Will Give You Shepherds. A very, very important work, as the Church has been involved in the formation of priests for 2,000 years, and we talked about some of that last time that we met. Today, though, I want to get into exactly what this document says, because it really does show a growing awareness that life has been and is changing. In the Second Vatican Council, for example, we have in the document Gaudium et Spes a very strong statement about the Church's awareness that psychology and sociology are very important subjects that help us understand the complexity of the human situation. Now, up until that time, the Church looked, almost in a very cautious way, if not a hesitant way, about those, what we call the social sciences. And yet, here in this document in 1965, the Church says we have much to learn from these social sciences, especially psychology and sociology. Now, the reason I begin there is that before 1992, really, and not 1492, 1992, there I am thinking of Christopher and the gang. But anyway, the idea was that if a young man was interested in the priesthood and he came from a Catholic family, it was a presumption that everything was pretty normal. It really was. I mean, life was not complex as it has become over the past half a century. Life was much more in order. There was an orderliness, and there were all kinds of presumptions. For example, that a Catholic family lived as a Catholic family, that the virtues were important in their life, that there was an awareness of relationships and how one interacted with these relationships. When I went to the seminary in 1967, they just began to have a very basic psychological conversation with the candidates. Very basic. Up until that time, in 1966, the candidates went through nothing. You just filled out the application form, and if the pastor said that you were okay, that you were okay. Well, things have changed. As we know, life is not as orderly as it had been, and that affects family life, social life, and to get a handle on that, we do turn to sociology and psychology to help us understand what it is that's going on. So, the Holy Father comes out with this document, I will give you shepherds. In other words, I will provide vocations to help the churches perform its work with people being called to priesthood. So the whole process of going and making it known that you're interested, that became much more complex, sort of reflective of that life itself. We can't presume all that we used to presume that a young man at 18 would come to the seminary with. First of all, divorce had become very large. So therefore, the stability of families for many was compromised. And the list just goes on of things that have happened in the last part of the last century. And so the Holy Father, realizing that, he said we really have to be very attentive to who we are talking with and how we do it and how we can benefit from the help of psychology in the conversation with a candidate. And so today we have vocation directors who are in conversation with those who give the psychological testing and how all this is done. When young men come into the seminary, the Holy Father said, we have to re-look at what we do with them. When I went to the seminary, it was you studied, you went to Mass, and you said prayers, and you had a little bit of apostolic work. That was, what comprised the seminary experience. Well, he came out and said, the seminary is built on four foundations, 4 pillars. The human dimension of life, the spiritual dimension of life, the intellectual, and the pastoral. So already he has added one very important aspect, the human. We used to take that for granted. That a person who went to a Catholic, wasn't a Catholic family, that they got that by osmosis, is really the way the church lived on a big presumption. It was true more than not, but as time has gone on, it's become less and less. Now, that doesn't mean that the person doesn't have a vocation. It's that you may have to work more to make sure that all of this is taken into account in that formation work. So, for example, when I was rector in 1999, I became the rector of the major seminary in Boston. And I had a priest, and his job, he was a psychologist from the University of Chicago, and his job was to oversee the human formation of these candidates. Now, he relied on all kinds of people. He relied on other experts. He relied on men and women. He relied on women religious order priests. But there was a full schedule of what you had special meetings about, you had conversations about the different aspects of our human maturing, how we mature, how we are able to integrate things into our lives on a human level. The spiritual level, there was a greater emphasis on spiritual direction. When I was in the seminary, you saw your spiritual director about every month or 6 weeks, and there was a talk once a month. Now, there would be an exchange, a conversation between a spiritual director and the candidate at the most. It would be at least every 2 weeks, if not weekly. Again, a conversation helping the man in his spiritual development. The intellectual remained pretty much the same, except there was an awareness of the Holy Father that the intellectual needed to be, by the teachers, it needed to be tied into, and the effect of it in the human and in the spiritual. It wasn't a standalone thing. You've ever heard that that phrase that a lot of people in higher education, they live in in a ivory tower type of thing. That I'm an expert in physics. Period. I'm an expert in Shakespeare's writing. Period. I don't know anything else, but I know that. And what they're saying is that no, you have to integrate that with what the people who are doing the human development and the spiritual development. You have to integrate that. You have to have that having an impact. And then the fourth thing, when I was in the seminary, we did some good work. It was kind of unorganized, but at least you went out there and you tried your best. Now you had a pastoral team, and you actually would be assigned to a parish, and you would be there for 12 hours a week. And you could very well have the DRE of that parish, who is your teacher, who knows how to run a catechism class and teaches the seminarians, the three of them, what to do, how to do it, why you're doing it, and all of that. And you're learning from laity and religious and priests in the parishes. So the whole thing became much more multidimensional. Why? Because the Holy Father realized that we couldn't make all those presumptions that we had been making for decades after decades, that they're coming to us pretty well put together. Well, they have a vocation, or at least they want to investigate it, but we can't presume that all the parts are already there. That we have to do a lot to help them be unearthed, and then to integrate the four of them. It's not enough just to do them. The danger is that there's no conversation between the academic people and the pastoral, or there's no exchange between the pastoral and those who are doing spirituality. In point of fact, it's really a team approach that all four pillars have to be integrated. I'm one person. I'm not four people. I'm not a human this minute and an intellectual a half hour from now, and a pastoral person. No. It has to be integrated that I am who I am, made up of these four parts. And the better the mix goes, then the more mature and alert and attentive the individual is. Now, I can remember when I was rector of the seminary, we used to bring in some of the older priests to hear their take on what the recently ordained were like. It was a great discussion. They couldn't figure out all this. We just did it. Well, you're right, Father, but however, times have changed. And it was a great learning experience for both. It was a great learning experience for the young men to hear the older men talk about what it was and how, in one way, it was simple, because you made all these presumptions that were favorable. Well, what the heck, if you make them all favorable, then the things just seem to go along. Well, it wasn't as all perfect as it was. And there was a real facing of reality in the late 1980s and into the 90s, that this is not the way we can continue to do business. We really need to be open to psychology and sociology to help us understand what it is that makes a person, and in a special way to be a person who is giving their life to God. All of that has a goal, and the goal is, according to John Paul II, the goal was pastoral charity. in a seminary, you want those who are going to be priests to be animated by pastoral charity as Christ was. You need to know things. You need to have a spiritual foundation. You need to be attentive to people's, needs. But all of it has to be, inspired by your desire to bring God's love to other people. A very, very important document that has had a tremendous impact on priestly formation, as seminaries had to, change how they did things. You had to send people away to get studies, like Father Nestor, the person that I didn't use his name the first time, but the psychologist that was on the faculty, he was sent away. He was in a parish. He was sent to Chicago to get a doctorate in psychology so that he would be able to do that as part of the dynamic in that seminary. So that, there was a real, a turning over of things to, so that things would become much more organized and helpful for the young men as they were going through. It helps them make a better decision whether or not priesthood is for them. And that's the goal, is to help them in discernment. The fact that you were accepted doesn't mean you're going to be ordained. The young man can very easily come to the awareness that, this isn't for me. And that's okay. There's no stigma against that. But the church also makes a decision. In fact, one of the teachings of the church is that the church has to make a decision about the usefulness of the person. Is he going to be useful to us? To be a priest? Has he integrated this appropriately so that he's able to carry on the work in a positive light? So I think that we're all affected by priests. And it's good that as we begin this series, that we look at one of those documents that has had a tremendous impact just in the short time from 1992 to now, just a little over 20 years. It's had a tremendous impact on how we go about this very important work. It's human, it's spiritual, it's intellectual, and it's also pastoral. Any person would like one over the others. I don't care if you like it or not. You got to get all four of them into your life. Either that or there's something wrong. Now, I would, I'll be very frank, the one that I would, be most inclined to would be the intellectual part. I like that. And when I first went to the seminary as the rector, you had to give a monthly talk. And I said, what am I going to talk about? So I started. I talked about, the overall picture of, I will give you shepherds. So that was January. February, I talked about the human element. And now these were hour talks that you had to do once a month. So March comes, and now I decide I'll talk about the spiritual part. And then April comes. And there it is, the intellectual. So I began. And, and the building was going through renovation. So, you met with the 200 guys in the chapel. So that gave it an aura of some, seriousness and all. So I began my talk. I hear tell that there's at least one of you who would have us run this seminary based on your humanity, strengthened by your spirituality, all for the sake of the pastoral work. And you just put up with the intellectual. Well, to that person out there, let me say this. you are humanly deformed, you're spiritually corrupt, and you're going to be pastorally useless. So please stand and leave. Well, they all looked like Attila the Hun had just come in the room. It was incredible. And I said to myself, I said, boy, that came out pretty good. I said, let me say that again. Well, I did. Well, when I was done, they just quietly disappeared. And the next morning at breakfast, I said, how's everything going, guys? Because there were 19 priests that I lived with. We had 20 of us, myself, and 19 of us who actually lived in the seminary. Well, anyway, they said, listen, last night, what did you tell them? They all came to our rooms and said, is he balanced? Is this guy, has he got it on straight? And they said, listen, he's holding us to the same thing, so don't look for sympathy from us. But anyway, that was one of my moments that I really became rather, very definitive about the whole thing, But anyway.